Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joseph Kilroy, and I'm Head of Policy for Ireland at the Chartered Institute of Building. You're very welcome to the May edition of our Aistriú series, which looks at the role of the built environment in the circular economy. The series is run by ourselves, the Chartered Institute of Building, CitA, the Irish Green Building Council, and GMIT. So far in the series, we've covered the role of clients in the circular economy, the role of industry, we've looked at life cycle, and then last time out, we considered the role of higher education. Today, we are looking at the role of local authorities, and specifically the role of planning authorities in catalyzing the transition towards a circular built environment. Now, this particular issue has been in the news quite a lot recently, not least in England, where the government is overhauling their permitted development rights regime, and that's a planning tool that allows change of use from commercial or retail or office into residential. We absolutely welcome the kind of flexibility that this planning tool allows, and from our perspective, it's very important that we embed flexibility early in the construction process so that when we do make these changes to our built environment, which we're definitely going to have to if you look at the way people's habits are changing under COVID, if we are going to introduce this kind of flexibility, we need to not sacrifice quality. And ourselves, the CIOB, and other professional bodies, the Institute of Architects, the Town Planners, and RICS have worked with the English government looking at ways that this can be done. And an example that we have used is from Amsterdam, where the city authority, the planning authority that is, I suppose, accessed this idea of the circular built environment by changing the port part of the city, which was a mono-functional working area just full of office blocks, and changed it into an urban living quarter. And they were able to do this because the local planning authority were able to use the quite prescriptive land use planning regime in Holland, which means they can actually prescribe that when buildings are first built in town centres and cities, they need to have the ability to adapt to changing uses over the course of their lifespan. So just an example of how the circular economy relates to the built environment there. I'm sure we're going to hear much more examples like that today, and we are looking at the role of local authorities, but our panel does have a distinctly international perspective, I would say. So we have Andrea Charlson, who is Senior Advisor for the Built Environment with ReLondon, which is a partnership of the Mayor and the London boroughs aimed at improving waste and resource management and transforming London into a low-carbon circular economy. We have Cécile Faraud, who is Clean Construction Program Manager with C4 Cities, which is a network of the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. And we have Tim Walker, Acting CEO of ARC21, which is an umbrella waste management group in Northern Ireland, representing 6 councils in the east of the province. So the running order is going to be Andrea first, then Cécile, and then Tim. I know Andrea has to leave early, so what we're going to do is we'll take questions through the chat box, please, once Andrea has completed her presentation, and then after Cécile and Tim, we'll do a kind of a mini panel at the end, and then Alan Hoare will see us out. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Andrea now, and her presentation is going to cover the Circuit project, which is an EU Horizon 2020 project encompassing 31 organisations across 4 cities. And she's also going to talk about an exciting new London planning policy in relation to the circular economy. So Andrea, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you all today. So as has already been mentioned, I'm from an organisation called ReLondon, and our mission is to revolutionise our relationship with stuff. And we do that through working with the Mayor of London and the London's boroughs, our businesses and our citizens, to help us as a city transition to a more low carbon circular economy. We have a range of focus areas as an organisation. So I've got colleagues tackling all these different resource streams throughout the city, and my specific focus is on the built environment. And the reason why the built environment is one of our focus areas is because of the scale of the impact. So the built environment contributes to around 50% of London's waste and around 10% of London's consumption-based carbon emissions. And there's also the global figures here. So 39% of the world's energy-related carbon emissions and 38.8 billion tonnes of materials annually. So it's a nice big challenge to be tackling. And our current activities that are related to the built environment, our two main activities are the circuit project and supporting the implementation of the London plan, which is the London-wide or the Greater London-wide planning policy. And I'm going to describe both of them to you today. So the circuit project, as we mentioned, is an EU Horizon 2020 funded project. We started in July 2019 and then we'll be continuing through to November 2023. So we're coming up to around the halfway mark of our project. And the core aim of the circuit project is to try and scale up the adoption of circular construction techniques and practices. So we're very aware that there's quite a lot of very good examples that have been happening over a number of years throughout Europe, but these tend to be ad hoc, niche projects led by a strong design team or a strong client. And so what we're trying to do is enable those interventions to happen citywide. Through providing the evidence base, the policy and the tools and other supporting resources for wider adoption. And through doing this, we're hoping to demonstrate that we can reduce virgin material use by 20%, show cost savings of 15%, as well as the resulting carbon emission reductions and also waste generation reductions. The project is a partnership between 4 cities. Greater London is working with the city of Copenhagen and Hamburg, and also the city of Vantaa, which is in the Helsinki region of Finland. And across those 4 cities, we've got 31 different partners who encompass all aspects of the built environment, from the city authorities themselves, through the design community, academic community, also manufacturers, contractors, and waste management organisations. We are focusing on 3 technical focus areas. So the first one is what we're calling urban mining, which is looking at the recycling and reuse of demolition materials. The second one is trying to avoid demolition happening through transformation and life extension of existing buildings. And the third one we are looking at is designing for disassembly and flexible construction to make the other 2 areas easier to achieve in the future. In each of these areas, we are creating new processes or adapting existing processes, and we're trialing them on 3 demonstrators for each of these focus areas in each of our cities. So we're going to have a whole body of a family of 36 demonstrators across Europe by the end of the project. In addition to these practical implementation demonstrators, we have a series of complementary work streams and activities that really focus on those aspects of scaling up that I mentioned at the beginning. So we have work streams looking at both data and tools. This work stream is looking at indicators and metrics, as well as what available data we have, what data we need, and how can we make that data accessible through online platforms. The work stream that I'm kind of focusing on today is looking at policy and governance. So what can the city authorities do? And then we have a work stream looking at networking and training. So we'll be providing training modules and online training modules as well as part of the program. And we've established a range of networks both within the partner cities and also with other city administrations from across Europe to help both steer what we're doing in our projects and also share the findings as we go. And so just a little bit about one of our most recent activities, which has been very specific to look at planning policy. We completed the report at the beginning of this year and it's due to be launched properly next month. So I've not got all of the details here, But the activity that we did was to look at recommendations of how various types of policies, and in particular planning policies, could help support more circular outcomes in the built environment, with a specific focus on those three technical intervention areas I outlined earlier. We did this through conducting a literature review both of existing policies from other cities and national governments, and also looking at a whole range of recommendations for policies, whether that's from academic literature or from industry literature. And after we identified those policies, we looked at the planning regimes within the 4 cities within the consortium to see how applicable they were within the city planning context. And we found that our 4 cities had quite different levels of autonomy to be able to apply different types of recommendations. And we also looked at how these different policy types could help remove some of the blockers that we were identifying through our research as inhibiting circular economy. The types of policies that we identified, we actually looked at about 5 or 6 different key groups, but the main ones we identified were in these 3 groups here. So the overarching recommendation was that it was very important to have set out a strategy and a roadmap. This is because not only can further legislative or regulatory instruments be built upon those strategies and roadmaps, but it also signifies a good direction of travel for the wider industry as well. So then coming on to legislative and regulatory instruments, the main ones we looked at, as I said, were planning policies, and we looked at a range of different types of regulatory instruments, some which could be specific targets. So for example, targets on where waste goes, for example, diversion from landfill targets, or targets around materials that are being used in the built environment, such as targets around a percentage for recycled content. There are also a range of regulatory instruments that are looking at processes. The idea to produce site waste management plans, or to conduct resource efficiency studies as part of the planning process. And then there's also a range of instruments that are kind of more on the incentives side, where a range of cities have different types of planning regimes, and they can actually allow different types of buildings, perhaps bigger buildings, or perhaps quicker or faster permitting if certain sustainability criteria are met. And then finally, we did look at fiscal instruments a little bit, although most cities don't seem to have a huge amount of leverage on the tax system, for example. But where there was a large opportunity across all of our cities was in public procurement. And so where many cities weren't able to promote those specific either processes or metrics that I've described in the legislative criteria, they could be promoted in the city's own procurement activities for construction projects. So as I said, there's more detail on the specifics of those findings going to be launched next month, and I've got the contact details at the end of the presentation if you want to be kept up to date with those. What I wanted to move on to next was what we found about London and on where London's going specifically with these regards as well. So the London planning policy context has been building up over a number of years. So I think it's important. So this accumulates in the new policy that was officially adopted in March, but the paving stones for that policy have been put in place over a number of years. So the first kind of policy reference, or strategy and roadmap reference to circular economy was in this document called London Infrastructure Plan 2050, and this was produced around 2017 or maybe 2018. It was really looking at what infrastructure might need to be provided for London in the future, which included waste management infrastructure. And this report embedded the ideas of the circular economy into the modelling that had gone behind the report. and so said that London wouldn't need that much more waste management provision as long as more circular economy ideas were adopted to reduce the amount of waste generation. And said that the new facilities that would be required would mostly be around reuse and recycling and repair, rather than kind of the traditional heavy waste management. Shortly following this, in around 2018, the organisation that I work for, we used to be called LWAR, we are now called ReLondon, produced London's circular economy route map. So this started to more clearly set out the vision for a circular economy in London, set out the challenges that need to be addressed, and also painted a picture of what was already happening and provided short, medium, long-term actions. Some of them were for policy and some of them were for industry. So it was very much action-orientated, and it was developed in partnership with all London stakeholders, from policymakers to our businesses and citizens as well. These ideas were then cemented into the London Environment Strategy, which is where we first set the aim, where the Mayor first set the aim for London to transition to a low-carbon circular economy. And then finally this year, the new London Plan was formally adopted. So this London Plan has been in development since that time, since around 2018. But it was formally adopted in March this year. It's the spatial planning document for all of Greater London. And circular economy objectives are woven throughout it in terms of objectives around growing a good economy, increasing efficiency and resilience, optimizing site capacity, reducing waste, and also waste capacity and waste self-sufficiently. And then following on from that, we also produced, the GLA produced Design for a Circular Economy Primer. And so this is really where all of those kind of strategic roadmap kind of documents start to become more specific to the built environment. It helps organisations across London understand how the built environment sector can contribute to a circular economy, provides definitions and principles and some examples. This is the specific policy that is in the new London Plan that very directly relates to the planning process, and specifically the planning process for individual buildings. So the Sustainable Infrastructure 7 policy states that organisations across London need to collaborate to promote circular economy innovation. It sets recycling, reuse and beneficial use targets for construction, demolition and excavation waste. And it also sets this requirement for circular economy statements to be submitted as part of the planning application for referable schemes. So referable schemes are schemes that are considered of strategic or significant importance to the Greater London area as a whole. There's certain thresholds for what becomes a referable scheme. And so now it's a requirement that a circular economy statement needs to be submitted with the planning permission for these referable schemes. And there's also the encouragement for local authorities across London who deal with all the rest of our planning applications to consider adopting circular economy statements for other planning applications. The policy states that circular economy statements need to cover these 6 aspects. So it really covers a whole life cycle aspect of a building. So it talks about materials arising from demolition and remediation works and their recycling and reuse. It also talks about the designs for the new building, looking to reduce material demand, thinking about through life material use and waste generation and end of life. They need to address management of waste and materials on site, including storage and space to support reuse and recycling. It also talks about where the waste will be generated and how it will be managed, and that's not just for construction, it's also in operation as well. And there's requirements for how performance will be monitored and reported. The policy has been backed up by some more detailed guidance on what circular economy statements should be and what they need to contain. This The most recent version is the draft for consultation. The consultation on this closed in January this year, and the GLA are currently collating and responding to all the consultation guidance. So there should be a formal version of this issued towards the summer. But this draft version is what current planning applications are assessed against. So this guidance document explains what the principles are to be implemented, describes what needs to be submitted as part of the planning process and when, and also provides some templates for reporting of specific aspects. The three core principles that are embedded that need to be demonstrated through the circular economy statement are around conserving resources, increasing efficiency and sourcing sustainably, designing to eliminate waste and for ease of maintenance. As I mentioned previously, that's eliminating waste throughout the whole building life cycle, from demolition to construction to operation to end of life, and managing waste sustainably and at the highest value. There's more detail on each of these principles in the guidance document. And the other core concept that is embedded throughout the guidance document and the submissions that are required for circular economy statement is this concept of building in layers. So all of the ideas and principles need to be considered not just for the whole building, but for the different layers of structure, skin, services, etc., that are within a building. And the guidance sets out that there are three types of circular economy statement. So if an application is a building, or a development is going for a pre-application meeting or is having an outline planning application submission, then the guidance sets out what the minimum requirements are for a draft circular economy statement. And that's really committing to like the headline objectives and policy requirements. At full application stage, a detailed circular economy statement is required to be submitted. This is a very substantial document, and it includes the bills of materials for the new building. It requires specific targets to be set for the building, whether that's on recycled content or the reuse of waste, for example. It also requires a number of design team workshops to have taken place and for the evidence of that to be submitted. And finally, there's a provision in the guidance as well for further circular economy statements to be requested. So these would be requested as stipulations as part of the planning permission. And the difference between these statements and the full application stage statements is it talks about progress against those targets and commitments. So the most obvious point for one of these additional statements to be requested is upon completion, where the GLA is looking for some kind of confirmation that the targets have been met, or if they haven't been met, they would like to know why, so they can further reduce barriers that may be coming from elsewhere. So as a summary, the three different types of statements. So the first one is to set out the intention if it's a draft statement. The detailed statements, as it says, develops the detail, provides concrete action plans and strategies of how it will be delivered. And the third one demonstrates that it's been implemented. From our perspective, and like from the research that we've done in Circuit, we've not found another policy like this in our literature review. It's really significant that it embeds the ideas of circular economy thinking across the whole life cycle really, really early on in the planning stage, because as many of us will know, it's much harder to implement any kind of change, whether for sustainability reasons or other reasons, later on in the design scene. So this statement, although it is a process requirement rather than a specific kind of target or measure, it is requiring some quite detailed thinking to have been done early on in the process. So we think it's quite innovative in that aspect. That was what I was going to share with you today. My contact details are here, and also the contact details for the Circuit project. So we have a project website and we regularly post on Twitter and LinkedIn, and that's where you can find the details of the upcoming publication of the full report.
Thanks so much, Andrea. That was really interesting and really useful. And I think from an Irish perspective, we're coming up to a new round of local development plans, which happen every 6 years. So I think some of those documents could be really useful for local authorities, particularly the primer that you mentioned. We've got a couple of questions coming through on chat, but I might just take chair's privilege first and ask you something that struck me. Given that what you're talking about is London-wide, and London obviously always has very significant housing targets, I'm wondering, did you get a lot of pushback from developers who kind of, you know, would hit you with the viability stick and say, this is all nice, but it's going to impact the viability of development, so you know, it can't be done if we're going to pursue our housing targets? Because it feels like, from an Irish perspective, whenever there is a new planning policy put in place, that always becomes part of the conversation. You know, this is a nice thing to have from a sustainability perspective, but viability. So I'm just wondering if you did have any pushback in that context.
From what I've seen on the consultation on the initial policy and the subsequent consultation on the guidance, that's not come back in that kind of way. I think the challenge is actually that the process that's been set out can be applied at different levels to different projects and with different amounts of ambition. And so, like, the devil is in the detail. We are aware that a lot of buildings get knocked down because you can get a higher density of houses if you knock it down and start again. And obviously that is in conflict with, like, the circular economy idea of preserving existing buildings. So we haven't really got to those detailed discussions yet. Like, the policy has only formally been enforced from March. So we do have a few early adopters that were doing it for the past year, but those kind of nitty gritty, we couldn't have this many houses and meet the circular economy targets, will probably be borne out in the detailed discussions on individual cases rather than on the conceptual framework for the statement.
Got it, thank you. One question that came through from Alan was, could you elaborate on the flexible construction initiative within the Circuit project?
Yep, so in the flexible construction area, we're looking at ways to design buildings either to facilitate their dismantling so that the components could be reused rather than them being crushed and recycled. And we're also looking at how buildings can be designed to be more adaptable throughout their life cycle. Again, to the idea of not having to knock something down prematurely because it can no longer meet the needs. A specific example that we're exploring through one of our demonstrators, well, two very different examples actually. One of them is around a housing project, but it's housing for the older generation. And the client is really interested in, can we use a more flexible, adaptable system so that as the residents' needs change over time, their dwelling can change with them to meet those new needs rather than the individual having to move to a different facility that has those needs. So kind of trying to find that and provide a better service or lifestyle for the aging population without moving people or knocking buildings down. And then other completely opposite end of the spectrum demonstrator that we've got in our flexible construction zone is looking at relocatable office buildings. So there's quite a strong desire to provide affordable office space in London for, like, small startups and innovators and things like that. And typically that's on a meanwhile space, so space that's planned for something else at some point in time. And so we're working with a couple of developers who are trying to use that space to provide affordable office space, but they are looking at building something that can then be moved to another location. So they're going to continue owning the building, and we're looking at two different systems for that. One is kind of like a modular pop-on, and another one is something that can be erected and then demounted, moved somewhere else and re-erected again. Flexibility is broad.
Yeah, that's great. I think anyone who lives in Dublin and is a fan of brutalist architecture will know that at the moment Dublin is faring very poorly on the don't demolish, reuse agenda. But another comment that has a couple of comments have come through. One from Alan saying modern methods of construction and offsite construction are very good at facilitating this modular approach. I think that's a point very well made. The other was earlier in your presentation, just asking were there any Irish partners in the Circuit project. I don't think so, but is it still possible to join? I'm just conscious we have quite a few local authority employees with us today.
Yes, so there is, we've got this city network, which I didn't describe. So we've got our 4 cities that are like the project partners, and then we have a city network, which is where we've reached out and built connections with 12 other European cities, like to help share that knowledge. We found our 12 cities, but we're not adverse to other cities kind of taking part and sharing the knowledge. So if there are people who represent councils here and city administrations, feel free to get in touch and we can link you into that network as well. We're also collaborating with C40 cities as well, so help broaden that dissemination and make that information available to as many people as possible. And we're also going to be just doing a webinar series in general. So everything we produce, we're putting on our website. We do lots of blogs, lots of news articles, and we've just started producing webinars and putting them on our website too. So even if you're not like in the network, there's still lots of ways to gain the insight.
That's great. Very good. Very good. I'm conscious of time, so we might just wrap it up there, and that you have to get away. But look, that was really, really useful, Andrea. Thanks so much, and we look forward to hearing more about that as it develops.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay, very good. So we are right on time. We're going to move now to Cécile Faraud, who's the Clean Construction Program Manager with C4 Cities, and her presentation is going to talk a little bit about the C40 network and its work and how it relates to the construction industry and clean construction and things like avoiding landfill and avoiding construction demolition waste. So pretty big topics there. Cécile, over to you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can see my slides, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to speak after Andrea, because there are a number of really good synergies and complementarities in our work there. So the first thing, for those of you who don't know, is to share a bit about C40. C40 is a city network that gather 97 cities now, which represent more than 700 million people in the world, but almost a third of the world economy. And our chair, this at the moment, is the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti. And you can see on the map that really it's a good spread from across all regions of cities that are represented and that are all united to tackle the climate crisis and really take climate action. But how do we specifically work on the topic that is the matter of today, which is on construction, is that we have a clean construction program that was launched in 2019 at the initiative of the city of Oslo. And the program is structured around, on one side, a city network, but on the other, a city, a clean construction forum, because we as city representative do recognize very much that it is a difficult topic. It is a very fragmented and global value chain, and collaboration is really essential if we are to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement and if we are to reach a 1.5 degree of overheating target. So the program has been focused on 4 areas, but really the first one was to tackle embodied emissions. So the mitigation angle and how does construction contribute to the climate crisis. And our definition of embodied emission really applies to the whole life of a building, or also of an infrastructure asset. So on the graph that you can see on your right, all of the colorful part of the graph basically are what we consider embodied emission. And it starts with the extraction of material, their transport to factories to be manufactured and processed into products. Then the transport of these products into sites where they are assembled. Then in gray, you have the operational emission of the buildings or the assets when they are used. But within this operational moment, there is basically also maintenance, refurbishment, retrofits that are needed, and that has an embodied carbon impact too. And then once the building, which is the end of its life in the best case, looking at how these buildings and these assets are demolished or ideally disconstructed, and then the waste transport and either the circular loop or in most cases still sadly sending to landfill. So we're really looking at embodied carbon from this really whole life approach perspective, and ensuring also that any decisions that we're taking on the embodied emission do not aggravate operational emission, but that there is a clear link between how the two can reinforce each other. But then it's also important, on top of the embodied emission, to recognize the impact that our choice of location, design, and material have on a city with climate resilience. So how does our choice of design and material can reinforce, for instance, the urban heat island effect, how the impermeable surfacing can reinforce issues with floods and flooding. So it's really important to get these also elements of the puzzle in the pieces, right? This element of the puzzle right now. And what has been really even more important to look at in the past year in a COVID pandemic world is, but also with the Black Lives Matters movement, really understanding what are the socio-economic impact of construction. How does it affect jobs? How do we embed a just transition? Really at the core of all of the action that we're taking, and understanding how does it affect the population and the community that will, in the end, be the user and the owner of our building and the places that we create. That's the remit of the program. And we have over 30 cities in the city network really working together to understand the work that they're all doing. Embodied emission and construction in general are not emissions that are in the city's usual GHG inventories. So it's their scope 3 emission. It's most of the time outside of their own boundaries. So it's what we call consumption-based emission. So it's a very new topic for them, and a topic that really they have at heart now to really better understand. So the learning of what other cities are doing and where do they start, if we look at this graph that I had on the slide before, each city starts at a different stage. It can really become from a waste perspective or from a rethinking or building and or planning in the first instance, or looking at air quality and how construction sites contribute to that, to really start looking at the whole process. The network is there to support cities in taking action and policy adoption. And then it's complemented by an industry and business partnership and collaboration through the forum. And that is really important to aggregate the demand signals and the supply signals so that policymakers really understand where the private sector is at, and that any action that they take is not only top-down, that there is also a real consultation and collaboration effort ongoing. It really helps also with consulting and looking at what is the emerging trends and innovation that city can push, reinforce, or where they need to do more. And the purpose for that is really to build trust, share the challenges, and really overcome them collaboratively. In November 2020, last year, we have launched a C40 Clean Construction Declaration, which kind of encapsulates our thinking on this topic. And we had 4 initial signatories with the cities of Budapest, Los Angeles, Mexico City, and Oslo, and a number of supporting partners from the industry. And this declaration really sets collective targets that not only cities are responsible for, but really the whole sector should be responsible for. And these targets are to reduce embodied emission by at least 50% by 2030 in any new build, major retrofit, and all infrastructure projects. And it has also a specific target on zero emission machinery and construction sites citywide that should be achieved from 2025 and be able to meet that by 2030. But then the declaration sets out 8 tangible commitments that the city are responsible for to meet their share of responsibility in meeting the collective targets. And I would just say that it's really urgent that cities take this target and that the private sector really respond to it and take similar targets, especially when we see national government calling on building their way out of the crisis. Not saying that we shouldn't build, but we need to embed the clean construction principles or the circular economy construction principle into this recovery package so that we're not releasing massive emissions, contributing to the climate crisis even more by responding to an immediate crisis. So there are a link there if you want to the Clean Construction webpage and to the video that we've made at the time. I'm not showing it right now. But just to share the specific actions that cities are taking to meet their share of responsibility. It starts by committing to prioritizing the existing stock by looking at vacant uses, vacant building, offices, and really tackling that. So for instance, Paris is really looking at repurposing their office space that are unused and build them and transform them into housing, which is something that we touched on at the very introduction of this session. Then it's about better use. That's the part about better use. But then there is also about repurposing and retrofitting before we consider building or demolishing and building anything new. Then it's really making use or their own powers and really using their municipal purchasing power and procurement to reward clean construction practices and avoid the generation of construction and demolition waste. It's demanding transparency and disclosure of data from the private sector, looking at LCAs, so life cycle assessment, and EPDs through planning permissions and building codes when they have this type of powers at hand. Because we all know that data and benchmarking can be a real issue. Then it's also collaboratively committing to developing a joint implementation pathways to meet the declaration targets, but really at the core of it, embedding circular economy principle to get there in a way that is just and inclusive. Then looking back at the climate resilience and adaptation angle of things, it's important for cities to really commit to assess the adaptation impact of their construction choices. And then looking at advocating at all levels where they do not have powers. So advocating locally with their stakeholders, advocating regionally with states and regions, and advocating nationally and internationally in the instances where they can join and share their voice. But it's also demonstrating the feasibility and making the case for a clean construction transition through pilot projects or demonstration projects. And there is a fantastic competition going on within C40, which is called Reinventing Cities, that really looks at transforming the way we see our buildings. And so I would invite you also to look, you can just Google C40 Reinventing Cities and you would find it, to look at this really inspiring examples of city leasing or selling lands or assets so that they can be built or retrofitted or new build for the best proposition rather than the best value. And all of this, you might wonder, how does it link with circular economy? Is that all of this action actually feed into what we call the circular, the construction hierarchy, that in my sense is really following the circular economy thinking, which is first by valuing and prioritizing, valorizing and prioritizing the existing assets that we already have. So that we don't need to have new materials and virgin material bring in to new build, but that really we make the best of what we already have. And that goes from optimal use of assets and repurposing them to retrofitting them when the need presents itself. But then it's also rethinking our relationship with the built environment and ensuring that we plan, design and build for the future with circularity in mind. And that applies both to retrofit and new build project. And start with extending the assets lifespan. We all know very well that assets are demolished before they reach the end of their use for many reasons. So how can we ensure through flexible design or design for disassembly that building are extended in their lifetime and that we use them at their maximum capacity, but also designing to really cater for climate resilience. We know that the climate is changing, that the way, even in here in UK or in Ireland and North Ireland, we need to look at not changing condition. We have potentially hotter summers. What does it mean for comfort, and how do we design our building to cater and cope with this? Then the third layers is really about using material efficiently and switching to low carbon, local and bio-based one. That also applies for retrofit and new builds. And really, it's important to make material efficiency and switch to low carbon, local, bio-based option at the forefront of any design plan. It's also about requiring clean construction sites, which is the last step on our hierarchy, which looks at optimizing the logistics and transport to and from construction sites. And that has a lot of potential also to look at reusing of material and construction products and waste, but also using low and zero emission machinery and construction sites. So you might wonder the type of actions that cities can do, and this relates very much to what Andrea was talking about in terms of actions that circuit cities are doing, which some of them are also C40 cities, which is first to set the vision and adopt strategies and targets that will provide confidence also to the private sector of the direction of travel. Then to look at the type of hard powers that are at their disposal, which goes from policies and regulation on building codes, on planning, zoning policies and permits, at circular economy and waste policies. One that is common across all cities, that all of them have, is procurement rules and specification. And really not forgetting the climate resilience policy that can also foster a circular economy in the sector. And then there are all of the soft powers that city can really make use of, which include convening communities and stakeholders around a common agenda, supporting education and training programs, which is really essential to get the workforce and green jobs unlocked. Needing to build the case, once again with flagship and demonstration project, looking at competition and awards that really incentivize the new practices and change of practices. And then the fiscal measure and financial schemes, either to support new innovative project or demonstration project, or really kind of play the carrot and stick where they have the powers to do so, which is, as Andrea was saying, less frequent. Something that we've released at C40 in 2020 was actually really a map, an interactive map, which is a map that you can see on your right, that share all of these type of activities that cities are doing, except for the convening and the education program at the moment, which are not there. But the policies, regulation, and pilots, as well as vision, strategies, and target are in the map. So you can really, it's called the Clean Construction Policy Explorer, and I will share the link in the chat after. But this map really allows you to explore all of the type of cities action that are being taken at the moment along this line to make a change. And this map is available in 5 languages, and it's also regularly updated. So if you see any policies that are missing, for instance, from Dublin or any other cities in Ireland or North Ireland, please do let us know. We would be really keen to add them. And to give you few examples of cities are actually taking action. The ones I wanted to mention are Paris, who has just released, for instance, in March this year, the Pact for the Parisian Construction, which is really inspiring. It's a pact between the cities and all of real estate developers, and that really lays out 10 principles that are all very much endorsing a circular economy approach to really start changing how the sector in Paris is moving along this line to reduce impact. Actually, I don't know if I escape. Can you still see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Still in presentation mode?
No, it's not in presentation mode. Not for me, anyway. Sorry.
So I will just leave that at 1 second, just to give you the proper example, which apparently I cannot see if I'm in presentation mode. So I don't want to tell you false data, but just to give you an idea. So Paris has set a target of 30% of new office building to be built reversibly by 2030 and 50% by 2030. And it's really interesting to see also the move from the national government, which is looking at having all new state-funded public buildings to meet at least 50% timber or bio-based materials by 2022, which is really short target. And the 10 principles of the Parisian Pact for the Pact for the Parisian Construction include reducing unnecessary paving and concrete surfacing, really looking at repurposing building rather than demolishing them, having really a focus on reusing construction materials, and prioritizing local, low-carbon materials, and reducing the use of concrete. And designing buildings to be reversible and modular and prefer design for disassembly, which is something that Circuit is also doing. But we have other examples. For instance, in Singapore, there are 2 policies going hand in hand. One is the Demolition Protocol that goes with a zero waste master plan, which both really put the circular construction into motion by requiring reusable and non-reusable parts of a building to be identified, separately dismantled, and removed before demolition can happen. And this has led to the development of several new materials, including recycling concrete aggregates. San Francisco and Portland in the US are also two strong advocates of these deconstruction and demolition audits. So San Francisco, since 2006 or 2006, sorry, has its construction and demolition debris recovery ordinance that really makes it illegal for anyone in San Francisco to remove construction and demolition debris from San Francisco residents, business, or municipal structure, and illegal to transport it directly to landfill. So that's really, there is a strong move in San Francisco to salvage material, to reuse them, to recover them, and they're looking now at the infrastructure that needs to be put in the city. So like a deconstruction hub and storage place, but also it's meant as a mean to provide this material to the communities that need it the most, and to train the workforce to deal with new techniques of building with these materials and to dealing with them. Portland, on its side, is really much looking at deconstruction ordinance and sustainable procurement policies that specify EPDs to compare and select low carbon material. So, and then the best example, best in class, usually in terms of circular economy, without surprise, are the Netherlands, with Rotterdam and Amsterdam, both having a circular program. So the Rotterdam is called the Circularity Program for 2019, and 2023. Amsterdam has its circular strategy for 2020-2025, and I've adopted the Amsterdam City Donut. And all of that, this program are really also embedded construction as one of the core sector and pillar of these strategies, and looking at embedding circular construction practices. So that's just to give you, sorry, in a nutshell, the number of projects that happen and that you can also explore in this map. And to conclude, I would just give this few, we're really helping, the topic is still very new for cities. So we really need to help them get a better understanding, educating them and guiding them along this journey. So we've put a number of resources on C4T Knowledge Hub, which include policy brief, how-to guides, case studies, city profile, or big research paper. I'm not going through all of this list. Hopefully you can share the slide with all participants later on. So all the links will be available. But this is it.
Thanks so much, Cécile. Really, really broad presentation there, with so much activity going on across the globe. And yeah, it's inevitable that when we're talking about best practice at local authorities, we're going to mention Holland. So we've mentioned them twice today. Let's see how many more times they crop up. But thanks so much. I think what we'll do, we'll move to the next speaker, and then we'll do a kind of a mini panel at the end and take questions at that point. But thanks so much for now, Cécile. Okay, so our next speaker is Tim Walker, who is Acting Chief Executive of ARC21, and his presentation is going to cover the evolution of the circular economy in the context of waste management. And Tim is going to talk about how he's currently trying to crack the nut of everyone wanting to get rid of waste, but no one wanting a waste disposal facility anywhere near them. So Tim, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm a professional waster. And my job is to make sure that the stuff everybody generates disappears every day, every week, every month, and every year, with a backdrop of European targets of one sort or other, or UK targets. So I've been doing this job for about 25 years, and yeah, I was responsible for dealing with all Belfast waste in its manifestations. And I've got a bit of a slideshow as to just where we came from and some of the pressure that exists on operational services as we move into dealing with waste in a different way and move away from the linear economy. As such, it may be slightly different from what you've heard around the building issues and the construction issues, but hopefully it'll be interesting nonetheless. So I'll see if I can upload my slideshow and take it from there. So hopefully you can all see that okay. I'll take silence as a resounding yes, you can.
Yeah, I can see it.
In which case I shall just start moseying on. I'm not sure if it's on full screen or if it's just at, yeah, let's see. Can I go
it's not full screen. But
there we go, full screen.
There we go. So,
yes, issues for catalyzing a council to achieve a circular economy. And my name's Tim Walker, and I've been acting as Chief Executive for R21, which is the collective of 6 councils on the eastern seaboard of Northern Ireland, dealing with about 1.2 million people. And the 6 councils are all the way from Mid and East Antrim, which is effectively Ballymena and Antrim, down to near Inmore. So, first things are, we're still very wedded to the linear economy, the take, make, waste agenda. And all the time, certainly in local authority land, we're being stressed to be more efficient. Now, the problem is with efficiency is it's a cost metric. So it's looking all the time at how efficient you are in using the money you have allocated. But very, very little of what we need to achieve around climate action or around waste reduction and improved resource management is concerned with efficiency. It's much more concerned with effectiveness. And so a disproportionate amount of time is spent focusing on efficiency at the expense of effectiveness. And the truth be told, we're never going to get to a better future if we keep on focusing purely and simply on resource efficiency. Doing the wrong thing better doesn't make it a better thing. In terms of waste management, circular economy goes so much more, so much further than just recycling. And yet so many people assume that recycling is the end game or more recycling is the end game. But the reality is that effectively recycling in many ways legitimizes the linear economy. It legitimizes that there will be discard. It legitimizes the fact that there'll be contamination. It legitimizes the fact that there'll be stuff falling out of the system. And yet if we're truly going to reduce the footprint we have on the earth, we're going to have to get away from the idea that there is such a thing as waste. Now, that's challenging. That's really profoundly challenging. And certainly it's deeply at odds with our current lifestyles. So there are multiple concepts underpinning circular economy. We've got things like cradle to cradle, industrial economy, biomimicry, one of my favorites, where we make items that effectively mimic natural items in the real world. Regenerative design, and this issue of regeneration is something that I think we do a great disservice to in the space of circular economy, whereby we're not looking to merely prolong items and make them last for longer and prevent pollution, but we're actually looking to build back better, to regenerate the environment that we've taken for granted for so long. Obviously in the circularity, and excuse me if you've covered some of this stuff already, but in terms of waste, it goes back to SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production. And the issue there is just how do we actually make better use of what we currently have more often for longer. You can see it's not embedded out solely in just one SDG, but the whole issue of circularity pulls in a number of other different sustainable development goals, which all play a significant part in addressing the overall issue around environmental improvement and human well-being as well. Ultimately, everything we have, from the shirt on my back to the window I'm looking out to the computer I'm speaking to you on, are all designed, which is this idea of creation with intention. So many of the buildings you've been hearing about, many of the cities we're hearing about, are designed with intention. And ultimately, we've actually designed this world around us. So if the world isn't working out the way we need it to be or want it to be, we can redesign it. That's the real challenges for us now. In terms of waste management, the issues we're looking at is how do we facilitate this idea of products to services, the servitization of items. And that in some regard is going back to the old days of radio rentals, where you rented your TV screen, you rented your washing machine or whatever. How do we have product life extension? How do we make the existing things we have last longer? And of course, is the EU directive effectively introducing that idea of right to repair. How do we dematerialize more stuff? And how do we do so in a way that actually is less impactful? So great, we've got Spotify, great, we've got streaming services, but what's the carbon impact from having those things? And modularity. How do we develop stuff so it can be upgraded for easy repair? And a big example, quoted time and time again, is Fairphone. And you buy this, effectively this platform phone unit, and you can upgrade it and repair it as time and fashion changes. The issue there of the Montreal Design Declaration is there just for background for those of you who want to read it, and I'm sure these slides were made available at the end for anybody who wants to follow up on them. Now, the circular economy was really articulated by Ellen MacArthur back in about 2011, 2012. Ellen MacArthur was a sailor who was racing in the Around the World series, and she had this lightning strike when she was in the Southern Oceans. And go, we only have the one planet, just like I only have this one boat. And if anything actually goes awry, there ain't anybody here to bail me out. So we better make better use of the stuff we have and make the stuff we have last longer. She produced the circular, or rather the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, working with McKinsey's, the big management consultancy, created the Circular Design Guide, which is a free resource about how you improve design. And there's a whole series of tools and methodologies there to help designers work through the various stages of circular design thinking. And obviously design thinking is profound because you're looking at the micro as to what you're looking to achieve against the macro of what needs to be achieved. We're going back then to take that into the micro of how do you do that? And then the macro of, and is it working? So there is that kind of, that push me pull you, that diamond analysis needed in terms of design, which is equally applicable in terms of building design, in road design, in infrastructural design across the whole piece. And you can see there the whole issue of product quality. This is why the likes of recycling ultimately actually leads to a deterioration of product quality. Because over time, the materiality, the operationability of the item declines and degrades. And therefore, recycling is not going to solve the problems of the linear economy moving to the circular economy. In Belfast, we were looking at how to address going into the future for years, and I was the head of Waste in Belfast. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. And I particularly like Peter Drucker. I'm big into management science. But Peter Drucker was saying that the best way to predict the future is actually to create it. And in Belfast's case, it set the Belfast agenda back in 2015, and it said, well, what are we actually going to do? And I said, well, we're going to set this vision for effectively 20 years, and we're going to look at all this great motherhood and apple pie stuff. Everybody benefits. Everyone fulfills potential. The vibrant, attractive, connected, and environmentally friendly city. I mean, all this is great stuff. And you'll find it very difficult to find fault with it. In terms of how that breaks down, though, there's then a whole series, a cascade of issues behind each of the kind of four pillars that made up the Belfast agenda. And it was looking at business growth. It was looking at active, healthy, empowered citizens. It was looking at matching peoples and skills to opportunities existing across the city. Developing the city's infrastructure. Again, these are great specific programs of work. They'll stretch over multiple years. And the issue was, okay, so how do we prioritize? How do we address those? How do we frame those as being important? And which ones, more importantly, do we knock off the agenda? When it comes to individual departments, and I was part of the People and Community, I was part of the City and Neighbourhoods Department, which reported to the People and Communities Committee. You can see here, they then temporalize all this by saying, okay, for next year, we're going to look at the following. We're going to look at local regeneration. We're going to look at playgrounds. We're going to look at street cleansing. We're going to look at community safety and community grant schemes. And we're going to look at the following kind of strategies. The amateur boxing strategy, the open spaces strategy, and the biodiversity strategy. We're going to look at a 10-year strategic waste and circular economy program. Happy days. We're going to look at monitoring and volunteering strategy and developing an action plan for that. And the piece 4. So lots of stuff that degrades or degenerates the high pollutant aspirations of the council into actual actions where you can put people, money, timeframes, etc., into that. But in terms of where we're going on waste, we're kind of dithering, to be honest. And the reality is that in terms of this Johari window, or what we more frequently call the Rumsfeld model, we're kind of moving out of level one, where we're actually beginning to be increasingly aware of how incompetent we are dealing with stuff and the profound impacts of that incompetence. So we're kind of dithering between level one and level two, really, at the minute on much of this environmental stuff. And it's profoundly difficult and challenging to what we need to do. Now, we haven't got Wally to pick up after us all over the time. But in terms of waste, if you don't get waste right, very, very rapidly, as this 3-day bin stoppage in Leeds shows, you have a problem on your hands. And that problem is quite specific and quite obvious and visible. In Belfast, we said, okay, let's go for it. Let's start looking at how do we move things on. We identified 8 specific areas of action. This is after we had the corporate objective of being on course to deliver zero waste direct to landfill by 2015, which I introduced in 2008 into the corporate plan. And we achieved it for 3 months, and then things happened externally. Things happened in terms of illegal waste movements and the cessation of exported materials, et cetera, we ended up going back to landfill. So we use this language towards zero waste action plan, to get the members to focus on, actually, this is what we're aspiring towards, zero waste. And here's the range of actions we're looking to address, 8 specific areas. And we showed effectively from the start of that in 2012 to 2015 how we drove recycling rates up by 12 percentage points as a council. Now that's pretty good going, because we're already in the mid-30s at that stage. And to increase the recycling rate from a 2% year-on-year growth to a 3% year-on-year growth with no additional monies was quite a feat. But on the graph on the right-hand side, you can see against the various targets that apply to us, we still weren't going to meet the 2020 targets. 2020 target of 50% recycling for council, going all the way up in terms of the circular economy package of 65% recycling by 2035. And as part of local government reform in 2015, we inherited large parts of Lisbon, some very poor parts of Lisbon. And that had a profound impact on our recycling rate, knocking 4 percentage points off of our recycling in 1 year. And the problem with recycling rates like this is they rebase to zero every year. We start again from nothing. And waste growth keeps on happening. So we knew there were issues coming over the horizon. We knew there were problems about infrastructure. We knew there were issues around increased city centre living and Brexit, the joy that keeps on giving, the gift that keeps on giving. And there was an issue about contractors and the limited number of contractors available to us and what that would mean in terms of value for money in an ever-reducing fiscal environment in the council. So Europe adopted the circular economy package in 2015, revised it last year. And it's identified things like, yes, we're going to have 65% recycling by 2035. We're going to increase packaging recycling. We're going to reduce landfilling to 10%. Now, is that landfilling of pure waste, pure residual waste, or is that landfilling of waste post-recycling as the discards fall through the system? We're going to reduce food generation. We're going to, there's all that stuff here. You can read it yourselves. There is quite a lot of stuff in terms of producer responsibility. And apologies, that's where I was first thing this morning, was meeting with a number of my colleagues in London about the producer responsibility consultation and deposit return scheme consultations that are currently live in the UK. And it will have a profound impact upon waste collection arrangements and treatment arrangements in the UK. So, very clearly, the objectives in the circular economy package are the ones I mentioned a minute ago: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use for longer, and regenerating natural systems. Those are the clear, distilled requirements, expectations, and objectives of the circular economy. However, we don't live in that world, and it's unlikely we're going to live in that world anytime soon. We live in this world where we rely on huge quantities of easily accessible resources and energy. And the likes of some of the Dutch research shows that the level of circularity in our world is actually going backwards, and we're going from 9.1% recycling down to 8.3% recycling in the last couple of years. we've got a huge and unhealthy focus on efficiency. But this doesn't actually affect the nature of the stocks. And you're seeing that around things like the fish and the fish engagement, around we want more fish. And that's one of the key bargaining chips around Brexit. And ultimately, our operating system is probably flawed. And if you look at the likes of climate change, something of the order of 40 to 60% of carbon dioxide emissions actually come from food production and manufacturing. So if we're going to address climate change, food production and manufacturing has to change profoundly. And then we've models like this. This is the butterfly model that Ellen MacArthur Foundation put up in 2013 or so. And you can see on the left-hand side the whole biological cycle. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, that all the biological and nutrient loadings should be recovered in such a way that they can be returned to the soil to increase the soil productivity and prevent the ongoing degradation of soil, the top 30 centimeters of the soil. On the right-hand side is slightly more difficult. And that's where we have all these artificially created products, which are not going to naturally degrade. And the plastics sit very firmly in this camp, where we have these single-use plastics, which last for thousands of years. And how do we start to reorient it? And one of the issues I have as a professional waster is that it can be tricky to have some of these conversations with manufacturers because they assume that I'm just nothing more than a bin man. But yet when I start talking about Kaizen Blitz and the likes of system, what is it, SPSS, to control logistics flow and manufacture, it doesn't square with them. So we do need to look very clearly at how we actually reuse, reduce, reprocess, remanufacture much better, with recycling actually being one of the outer loops on this system. We also need to recognize this isn't going to happen overnight, and that we've already been working on some of those other schools of thought I highlighted earlier for decades on this. So we've got to recycling rates in the 50s, in decades, and it's required a significant investment of time and effort by many, many people like me. And we've got decades to go. So how do we bridge the gap between today and where we need to be to have that circular zero waste society? Because we're not going to magic it with some sort of wand like Harry Potter. Recognizing that the zero waste plan brought us to 2015, in Belfast, we said, okay, where do we go next? And we said, well, we've got to do better. And again, this language is important. We said, okay, the waste framework, paradigm shift is needed. We've done really well, we've got to mid-40s, and we need to do more. And if everybody recycled everything they could tonight, we would save £2 million and increase the recycling rate in Belfast by 20%. So all the councillors hear this. Many of the MLAs, the members of the local assembly, hear this. Some of the MPs hear this. Some of the ministers hear this. Does it change anything? No. And that's one of the problems we have, is there is this, the weight and level of change required is significant. We identified we're going to have to change collections. We're going to have to change, we're going to have to use nudge theory here. You know, the Sunstein and Baylor, the Daniel Kahneman stuff. We're going to have to fundamentally change stuff because the existing architecture ain't working for us. So if we've got bins all over the place and the bins have got us to where we are, we're going to have to do different stuff. We're going to need to invest in different infrastructure, and that's going to be costly. We're going to need to use technology better. We were using wonderful ticker tape tables to look and see on an annualized basis, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, what was going on with different bin routes, what level of performance was being yielded, where was contamination going, was contamination this week worse than last week, what was the productivity per crew, were they on 1,200 collections a day, or was it 1,500, or was it 800? And behavioural. I mean, there was lots of stuff around behaviour. And we were going to people and meeting them on their doorstep, talk with them on a basis. And we had 25 staff engaged across the city at various times to go and have those conversations. And the focus here, managing waste, delivering value, and supporting jobs. So it wasn't just about we're taking the waste and making it disappear. It was actually about this is an economic prospect as much as it is an environmental prospect. And we followed up with our waste framework with Resourceful Belfast, where we did a mapping exercise to see what the material flows through the city were. Belfast, local authority, we dealt with around about 12% of the waste that was actually generated in Belfast. We developed a partnership with WRAP, the Waste Resource Action Program from the UK, to say, how do we address this? How do we profoundly change the nature of things? We set up the collaborative circular economy network with Invest Northern Ireland 1 and 2, pulling in the likes of Huhtamaki, pulling in the likes of cherry pipe polymers, pulling in the likes of natural world products, to start focusing in on what level of materials are you looking for, how much can we give you, and what can you use it for? And can you create local employment in the prospect? And one of the big things for me was we took the language, I took the language, and got the language of the circular economy enshrined into things like the local development plan for the council, all the way through to 2035, recognizing that there would need to be a change in terms of the nature and type of infrastructure dealing with this. So remanufacturing, what land use zoning would it fit in with it? What size of plant would you need for this? Also got it into the corporate plan, and recognizing the circular economy is going to be a key thing going forward, into the climate change agenda, into the funding arrangements. So all these were quite tricky to do and required a lot of effort and heavy lifting to get them in and to keep them in. And that's my presentation. So finish on a high note. So thanks for that. And hopefully there's some points there that we'll be interested in picking up on. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was really, really useful. And I found personally the distinction between the linear and the circular economy at the outset very, very useful, although I'm sure that's a basic distinction in this game. There's a couple of questions coming through on the chat for both Cécile and Tim, but I'm just going to take chair's privilege again, because one thing that struck me about both presentations was this question of behavior change and incentives, and it came up for me in two different contexts. So Cécile, you were talking about the need to retrofit and to reuse rather than demolish and rebuild. And vacancy in Ireland has been a nut that we've been trying to crack from the built environment perspective, basically since the economic downturn, where we've got a lot of vacancy in our town centres and a lot of peripheral development. And we're trying to work out a way to get people to reoccupy these vacant buildings. We've had, I think it's safe to say at this point, a failed vacant site levy, which didn't work due to administrative reasons. And I suppose my question is there anywhere that has done this incentive measure for vacancy quite well? Has anywhere brought people back into using vacant buildings through a particular policy measure? That's for Cécile.
Thanks, Joseph. It's a really good question. I would say, I'm sorry, I'm a very strong French accent, but I'm based in London. And if I'm going to give an example of Paris, it's not because I'm French. That's my caveat, but it's because they're really doing interesting work there. What is difficult with using vacant building is really much in which state they are. So what we need to ensure is that it still meets people's need and people dreams, in a sense. A lot of problem that we encounter all along the circular economy implementation is that sometimes people don't want second best, right? They want new, shiny products. And this is a tension that we need to crack, and that goes into what Tim was referring as a behavioral change. Like, we need to revalue how we see things. And there are some tension about asking for retrofitting and meeting new regulation for energy efficiency, for instance, in buildings. So for schools, it's how do we ensure that we meet energy efficiency standards and new regulation when we retrofit? Sometimes it's impossible. So we need to make this choice with, do we want 100% energy efficiency or do we want the best energy efficiency that we can with the best materials that we can for re-insulating and retrofitting an existing building? And does that meet the space constraints that we need also in a COVID world to have, the distanciation that we need. So that's the first thing, and I don't think any cities yet has cracked that. But a number of them are definitely working around ways to that. And so what Paris has done is really looking at the Haussmannian building, which luckily enough in Paris, it's this big building in stone, the iconic buildings in Paris streets. They were made for housing initially. But then with the change of city center being way more turned into office space, most of them were turned and transformed into office space. So Paris has set up a number of incentives and sticks to basically look at which one were vacant and therefore really say, okay, we have a housing crisis to tackle. So we need to ensure that we provide the incentive and we favorize, we speed up the planning permission for those that will repurpose this office space into housing and homes. But that was possible because the structure of the Haussmannian building doesn't need to change. What needs to change is interior and the bathrooms, right? Needs from an office to a home. So that's one of sorry, it was a very longer answer than I anticipated.
That's very useful because I guess we've had a similar repurposing of Georgian buildings from residential into offices in Dublin, and maybe the time has come to have that conversation again. Tim, similar question for you. You talked about the use of nudge theory and so on, and for me, and I'm sure with most people who are part of a household, I'm kind of fascinated by this question. What are the kind of nudge theories that you think are effective in terms of getting people to reappraise their relationship with waste, which is, fundamentally by the sounds of what you think we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of stuff about carrot and stick back in the day. And then we said, well, carrot and stick is a bit binary. So we went to carrot, stick, and tambourine. So we're saying, do this and we'll give you some rewards. Do the other and we'll try and penalize you, and we'll have waste officers out, and we'll be looking in bins, and we'll be looking to issue fixed penalties. And that doesn't really work very well in certain cities and certain regions because, well, in some areas the police have issues, never mind the fact that this is a waste officer going in. So we also did the whole celebration thing, and we tried to get funding from the likes of Coke to sponsor good behavior. Again, that doesn't appeal to everybody, and we found that students were pretty resistant to the idea of getting up out of bed and doing stuff to make sure they're recycling it out. Even when awards or prizes of over £1,000 were being awarded. I was gobsmacked, and I was quite prepared to take part myself, but I'm afraid I failed to qualify by several decades. So we moved on to the more challenging aspect of nudge, where recognizing that if you look at the 4 E's of engagement, education, enforcement, and the other E that I forget, you actually need to have a mix of the 4. And it's going to shift depending on socioeconomic, it's going to shift depending on age, it's going to shift depending on time of the year, and you need this toolbox. But ultimately, when it came to waste, after looking at a lot of this stuff, we said the best thing to do is a direct intervention. So if everybody's recycling more stuff, stop collecting the bins as often. Because there shouldn't be as much stuff in the bin. We found in inner Belfast at the time that people automatically defaulted to their black bin, their residual waste bin. And it was only when their residual waste bin was full did many households then shift to recycling. We found in some of the more affluent areas of the city that the doctors, lawyers, etc., were too busy saving people's lives to focus on recycling. It was beneath their station. And therefore, we started to say, we'll go to fortnightly collection, we'll consider going to 3-weekly collection, we'll consider going to 4-weekly collection. We're also not necessarily going to stick with commingled collection, everything into one bin like the green bins in Ireland. We'll actually stream the material, because speaking to the likes of Huhtamaki, they're saying that the material coming out of commingled collection is too dirty. There's too much chance of a yogurt pot being stuck to the paper. There's too much chance of a nappy being mixed in there. You pick up 40, 50 nappies 50 kilograms of nappies per month in the recycling. So that's not a really good addition to the recycling materials. It doesn't add much to it. So if you start to stream materials at the curbside, it changes your entire paradigm on capital and revenue spend, because you require many more staff, many more vehicles, but you get a much higher resale value and a much better quality of material, which can be fed into the local economy, as opposed to putting it on a boat and sending it to China, which was done with many of the stuff before, and which is why the Chinese restriction on the market access back in 2018 has caused havoc to the global market and global supply. And so there is a bit of constipation occurring in the recycling industry, because all this material, low-grade recycling material, is currently backing up across the world, because it's not easy to find an outlet for it. And in that regard, in a circular economy, in a globalized circular economy, what happens when you've got collapses, when you've got a boom and bust in the supply market? What do you do with those materials? Where do they go? How long do you stockpile them for before you declare them written off? And once you write them off, where do they go?
I'm conscious of time, but just on that point, there's a related question coming through from Elvira, I hope I've got that right, Callahan, and she's pointing to this issue of how much is a kind of fundamental concepts of capital economics, like maximizing profit, front economies of scale, planned obsolescence. How much are they responsible for the situation that we're in? And are there some similarly graspable ideas within the circular economy that we could use to move away from this, or would that be a too simplified view of things?
Well, we're in the position we're in now because of the Western model of capitalism, generating, roughly speaking, 500 kilograms of waste per year personally, with a times 10 multiplier upstream in terms of discard from forests and soil movement and everything else. So if each of us are responsible for something in the region of 5 tons per year, you very rapidly realize that's not sustainable. So when you start looking at the circular economy, you're beginning to look at things like the sharing economy, the likes of Uber, the likes of eBay, etc. When you strip it back, though, ultimately the idea of profit has to come from something. What is profit? Something correctly costed in the exchange between you, the consumer, you, the producer, you, the distributor, retailer, whatever. As we build profit into the entire system, that becomes difficult and tricky. And so for many environmentalists, you don't have to scratch the surface too far before you start getting into some version of communism. So yes, the capitalist model has resulted to where we are now. And going back to that idea of design, we designed this model. If we're going to go to a more carbon neutral, more zero waste society, it requires a fundamental reboot of the operating model, the operating system, and it's systemic change. We'll need to turn down the amount of meat we eat. We'll need to turn down the amount of stuff we own, the number of road miles we travel, etc., etc., etc. But, the chances are that we have much more time to do other things. We need to work as hard as we work. I mean, one of the problems working, Cécile and I was working in London, 95 hours a week is not enough. It's just not enough. There's always work there. Why is that? Should we be pushing for a 4-day working weekend?
That's great. Just a couple of book recommendations coming through. One, Kate Raworth, Down in Economics. Thanks, Cécile. One that I would recommend in this context is Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, which has got a bit of a circular economy thread running through it. But look, that's really brilliant. Thanks so much, Tim and Cécile. I'm sure we could, given that we're questioning the fundamentals of the capitalist economy, I'm sure we could probably go for another couple of hours, but it is 2 o'clock. So Alan, do you want to take us out?
Yeah, just taking up the point there from Tim and time. It is time to wrap things up. I've really enjoyed this event. Just like to thank you, Joseph, for chairing today. To our speakers, Andrea and Cécile and Tim, and to the CitA team, the backroom team to do all the hard work, Eleni and Shannon, and also to you, our delegates today. It was great that you stayed with us right through. The quality of the presentations were really exceptional. What I would say, just to wrap up, is that CitA is wholly committed to this series in partnership with GMIT, CIOB, and the IGBC. There's no doubt we all have a collective and shared responsibility to our planet, and our climate change targets. Up to now, we've heard about the EU Green Deal, the World Building Council. We heard from educators. We heard from researchers like the DASB project that was funded by the Human Capital Initiative in Ireland. Today, we heard from planners. Next month, we're going to hear from clients, moving on to designers, contractors, manufacturers, and cities. And we'll be finishing looking at BIM and digitalization. I suppose that's where CitA sits in the digitalization piece. And you know, the role of building information modeling, digital twins, whatever you're looking at, there is a definite role to play. So the 3rd of June will be our next meeting. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Arup and Diatech for sponsoring this series. Just to make you aware also that we're very active this year. We're doing little but often events rather than larger events. So we're back here again on the 20th of May looking at technology like drones. We're moving on to digital twins and on into robotics and all the good stuff in the world of digital construction. So look, thank you so much. We're a little bit over time. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Cécile. And thank you, Tim. Fascinating presentations. We're not the experts in sustainability and circular economy, but we do want to create a network of people that start to look at and listen to the messages that you had today. And so it's a slight departure for CitA, but it's a really fascinating one for us, that we're only really a small part in the whole ecosystem, and we need to think in a circular way. So thank you. Good health, good happiness to all of you, and don't work too hard. Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thank you.